I once had the pleasure of being in Quito in Ecuador, where I was able to visit a work set up by a Jesuit who's since gone to God, Father John Halligan. John arrived in Quito as a young priest, I'm going to say in his 60s. And by his own account, he said to me he didn't really have a proper job. He was born in the Bronx, had a thick Bronx accent right up until the end of his life. I met him when he was in his 80s. So he thought, what am I going to do here? And he noticed that in the beautiful square in Quito, these little boys would be always wanting to shine the shoes of the tourists, etc., and businessmen. And he realised that these little fellows were providing most of the income for their families, and they were, even pre-teen. And it became very clear to him they were uneducated, they were poorly fed, and they, of course, were vulnerable. And so he begged and borrowed and got a little space in a dusty old attic, I think in the cathedral to start, to have a place for them to begin to learn, have a bit of schooling, get fed properly, and help support. It was called the Working Boys Centre. And it grew and it grew and it grew. It became the Working Family Centre. And when I visited it, they had an extraordinary building where they would feed hundreds of families, breakfast and lunch. They had a lot of little businesses too. John had never done an MBA or anything, but he could work out that these people needed jobs. And so they had a little factory, they had all sorts of things. And they were more or less successful. He could break even. When I met him, he confided in me that they were having terrible financial problems. He didn't know if he could pay the staff, which by that stage were scores of people, not to mention all the beneficiaries, all the visitors to the centre, all the families. But he had the most wonderful response to that problem. And it had happened to him a number of times over the years where he thought, this is not going to work, we've got no money, we've got terrible problems. And he didn't try to engage McKinsey or something. John would go to the little chapel and he would pray on his knees and beg God for help. And it came. It came. He kept it going. The money would come. He told me on one occasion in the early days, he was very concerned. And it was a Jewish businessman turned up and ended up giving him a couple of $1 million, where it then exploded into a much larger ministry. John was a good man, a good priest. But what I took away then, and I still do from meeting people like John around the world, is their extraordinary faith, their lack of fear. At least their fear is tempered by their faith. The fear doesn't grab the steering wheel, if you like. They won't allow that. They insist that their faith does that. And also the opposition that these people face. They are fools for Christ. John told me that he knew that he was mocked for being this dreamer, didn't have a proper business plan, didn't have a proper strategy, etc., etc. And around the world you meet people like this, followers of Jesus Christ, in a style of compassion and closeness to the poor. Not to say business plans aren't important, but don't put the cart before the horse. The horse, the driver, is faith in Jesus Christ. Belief in the gospel today, put out into deep water. Do not be afraid, Simon. The extraordinary contrast between the challenge, if you like, in human terms. And Simon says, but we've been trying all day and all night and caught nothing. What you're saying sounds impossible. And Jesus says, nonetheless, do it. And of course, they end up with more fish than they could have imagined. And so often in the lives of really good disciples, you see that in the saints, this mocking that goes on, scoffing inside the church just as much as out. And yet the Lord provides time and time again. I knew a fellow, I met him, he was a priest when I met him, when he was a younger man, he volunteered with Mother Teresa for quite a number of years in Calcutta. And he said, Mother Teresa had incredible faith in Providence, that she would say to him in the morning, please go and get me 7 bags of, we'll say, barley. He'd say, but sister, where from? Mother, where from? Don't worry, you'll get them. What if it's only 5? She said, no, 7. He'd go out, sure enough, he'd say time and time again, her very precise request was met out of the blue. 7 bags of barley. He said, it didn't make sense, but to her it was the most sensible thing because she had faith. An extraordinary gift of faith, despite her own, as we see in her diaries, dark times of anxiety. So we're called to be a church that doesn't put the cart before the horse, doesn't get caught up in, God forbid, bureaucracy, that doesn't scoff at the dreamers, amongst whom are many saints, that encourages. I like this little story I'm going to share with you. It's a little parable of sorts. There's this, the devil's having a garage sale, and he's got price tags on all of these various things that are very important to him and to many people as well, we know. So he has pride, $100, whatever it might be, all these sins lined up. And there's one at the very back, and the guy comes in with a garage sale and says to Satan, what's that at the back? I can't really make it out. It's in its own room, looks very special. He says, yes, that's my most prized possession. That's the thing that works a trick every time. He says, well, what is it? Can I have it? He said, it's called discouragement.